And so we come to Wallace and Gromit's magnum opus, their first and only cinematic venture. While it's certainly great to see them on the big screen, and it does result in a really entertaining film, I feel that a feature length wasn't really the thing that Wallace and Gromit were made for. But for now, let's just take a look at the plot. In the duo's ever-changing careers, they're now humane pest control, helping clear people's gardens of vegetable-munching rabbits in preparation for the big veg fest in their hometown. After finding out their enclosures that they put the rabbits in are getting a bit too overcrowded, Wallace tries to come up with a way to brainwash the bunnies so that they'll no longer like vegetables anymore. And despite some hiccups, it seems to work. That is, until a massive rash of violent veg violation happens all throughout the town from a supposedly giant rabbit, dubbed by the townsfolk as the Were-Rabbit. And of course, Wallace and Gromit get on the case to sort it out, but doing so may be a lot harder than they first imagined. As stated in the last video, one of the many problems that Aardman had when going to the medium of full motion pictures is they tended to adopt plots and narratives that were rather derivative and predictable. With Wallace and Gromit's first and only foray into film, however, that wasn't necessarily the case. The film has a plot that, for the most part, you don't really know where it's going, and that's very impressive, especially from a Wallace and Gromit story, and it results in the title characters going through the things that you'd never thought they'd go through before. I won't say what the big twists are here, since it would ruin a lot of the movie, but needless to say, it's definitely a change from form, and in a good way, and while some might be able to predict the plot from just the title, it still goes in directions you wouldn't expect when involving these characters. Sadly though, despite the plot being very creative and effective, one of the reasons that made Wallace and Gromit shorts work so well is that they took stories that were wacky and large in concept and shrunk them down to be more down to earth, partly due to the charming tone that these shorts were known for, but mostly due to how they were only 30 minutes long, and thus they would have a smaller scope to them, which you might think might make this movie perfect as they were able to take the story to its full potential, but it does seem a bit jarring to see a very cinematic scale in a franchise that's made its money from being very quaint and homespun. That being said, this by no means ruins the movie. In fact, it's still great to see Wallace and Gromit go through more than they ever have done before, and this could have been the perfect bookend to the franchise. Of course it wasn't, but that's neither here nor there. Also, as a side note, I feel that the behind the scenes of this movie proves emphatically better than any audience reaction how off-the-wall Aardman movies can be, in that it was going to originally be called The Great Vegetable Caper, but Jeffrey Katzenberg, the head of DreamWorks, advised against calling it that since vegetables don't test well with kid audiences apparently. Yet genetic realignment and puppets made out of Play-Doh are fine apparently. Speaking of DreamWorks, after the success of Chicken Run, they must have really let them go wild with the budget and equipment, since the sets and animation are some of the best in Aardman's history, especially near the end. And while the climax of this movie isn't quite as exciting as the previous shorts, it's very different from normal and it's still very gripping, particularly given the revelations that are made in the third act. Also, this is the largest cast of any Wallace and Gromit story. Now the whole town of Wigan is along for the ride, and while they're not as fleshed out as the side characters in Chicken Run, their vocal performances do provide a decent job in making them memorable. Helena Bonham-Carter as Lady Tottington is a hilarious but charming aristocratic love interest for Wallace.
Consider yourself dumped.
Though their chemistry is nowhere near as adorable as him and Gwendolyn. Nicholas Smith as the easily fretted vicar is a great role. Mrs. Cropley from The Vicar of Dibley's actress Liz Smith does a great job as Mrs. Mulch.
Aye, and I hope they give them pests what's coming to them and all.
And of course we have the great Edward Kelsey, aka the Colonel from Danger Mouse, as Mr. Growbag.
Kiss my artichoke!
Who is always a great addition to any cast. Even Peter Kay's cameo as the police officer is a decent role.
Hey, give over! Mental.
Sadly, despite everything in this movie successfully capturing a very cinematic feel, the villain was not one of those things. With such a great lineup of rogues in not just Wallace and Gromit shorts but in the Aardman gallery in general, it's a shame that the movie villain is rather disappointing. This was Aardman's first attempt to make a more jokey villain with Victor Cordemay, and while that will work to their advantage in the future with the Toad and Queen Victoria, here it just comes off as rather disappointing, especially when he's not really that funny. Granted, he does have a few funny lines, and he is performed well, which comes down to the fact that he's voiced by Ray Fiennes, but that makes him even more disappointing given that he's played other villains so well in the past. And the thought of having him as the villain in a world as surreal as Wallace and Gromit is so exciting, and yet it's just wasted here. Then again, it would have been a bit of a far-reaching hope to imagine him as good as Ramesses and Prince of Egypt in this movie anyway. Also, this might be a bit of an odd observation, but did anyone think the innuendos near the end were a bit out of place?
I think you deserve this, Gromit. For a brave and splendid marrow.
Matron, take them away!
Overall, while the movie is by far not the best of the Wallace and Gromit franchise, I really don't think it deserves to be treated as the black sheep of the lot like it tends to be. The plot is intriguing, the scale makes the set pieces a ton of fun, and we still get the same lovable characters that we always have, but I can see why some people were disappointed in this, especially since it seems as if DreamWorks were continually interfering with the process and trying to make the movies their own, and this will be seen to a much greater extent in the next movie.